In the cold, sterile silence of the courtroom, Smitty's world was shattered. Once a man who held control over his fate, he now stood frozen, paralyzed by the weight of betrayal. The man he trusted most, his closest ally, his confidant, had just thrown him to the wolves in a desperate bid to save himself. With a single, crushing decision, Martin betrayed everything they had built together, offering up Smitty as a sacrificial pawn in exchange for a reduced sentence. But what was the price of this treachery? For Smitty, it would be far more than his freedom, it would be his very soul. As the gavel fell, sealing his fate, Smitty's mind spiraled. Betrayed, angry, and driven to the edge, he realized that the battle for his survival was just beginning. With nothing left to lose, he would stop at nothing to make Martin pay. But the line between justice and vengeance is razor thin, and as the darkness of revenge consumes him, Smitty must decide how far he is willing to go. In the shadows of his broken trust, a new, deadly game is about to unfold, one where the stakes are higher than ever, and only the ruthless survive. The courtroom was eerily silent as the verdict hung in the air, thick with tension. Every eye in the room seemed fixed on Smitty, whose entire life had led up to this moment. Standing frozen in place, he felt as though time itself had stopped. His thoughts, once clear and confident, now spiraled into a pit of uncertainty and dread. What he thought would be a day of justice had instead turned into a nightmare. The weight of what was to come crushed him, but he couldn't escape it. The room felt colder as the gavel struck, the echo reverberating against the walls, marking the end of a chapter in Smitty's life. A chapter he had never intended to end like this. He had done everything right, played the game by the rules, yet somehow, here he was, about to face a fate he didn't deserve. But this wasn't the worst of it. What came next was a blow Smitty couldn't have prepared for. He had always trusted Martin, his closest ally in the criminal world, the one person who knew his deepest secrets and shared in the web of lies they had woven together. They had built something powerful, a partnership forged in the fires of betrayal, shared ambition, and a mutual understanding that the only thing that mattered was survival. But Martin had made a choice. A choice that shattered everything. As the judge prepared to announce the sentencing, the unexpected happened. Martin, who had once stood by Smitty's side, suddenly stood up. His voice was calm, but his words were a storm. "I cannot continue this charade," Martin declared, his tone void of remorse. "All of it, every crime, every betrayal, every shady deal, was mine. I will take full responsibility. I will plead guilty, and I will take the deal. Let Smitty go." The room fell into a stunned silence. Smitty's heart stopped for a moment as his body went cold with shock. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. It was as if the world had tilted, and he was falling into an abyss from which there was no escape. Martin, the man he had trusted more than anyone, had turned on him. All the promises, the late-night conversations, the blood they had spilled together, gone, just like that. Smitty's mind raced. Was this a last-minute move to protect him? Was it guilt? No. It wasn't guilt. It was survival. Martin had always been about self-preservation. And now, he was throwing Smitty under the bus, willing to sacrifice their entire partnership for a chance at freedom, for a chance at a life without the constant fear of being caught. Smitty's breath became shallow. The room seemed to spin, his vision narrowing as his anger bubbled up inside him. Betrayal. The word echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, growing louder and louder. This wasn't just a betrayal of their partnership, it was a betrayal of everything Smitty had ever believed in. A betrayal of trust, of loyalty, of everything that made him who he was. How had Martin, the man who had been his closest friend, his confidant, become the one to ruin him? How had he gone from being his brother in arms to his executioner? Smitty felt the rage building, an inferno of fury burning deep within him. But there was no time to act. The courtroom was still in chaos. The judge had ordered a recess, and Smitty was being escorted out of the room, his mind spinning, his world unraveling. The hallway outside the courtroom was cold and sterile, the harsh fluorescent lights flickering above. Smitty's footsteps echoed, each one a reminder of the life he was about to lose. But as he was led down the corridor, the weight of the betrayal began to sink in. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. How could he let this happen? How could he have been so blind? And yet, in the back of his mind, a new, darker thought emerged. If Martin thought he could walk away unscathed, if Martin thought he could betray him so easily, then he was wrong. Smitty would make Martin pay for this. He would make sure that Martin would never be able to escape the web they had created together. He would do whatever it took to destroy him, to show him that betrayal had a cost, and no one walked away from that unscathed. The prison cell was colder than the hallway. Smitty sat on the edge of the metal bench, his hands clenched into fists. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The room was silent except for the distant sound of guards' footsteps echoing down the hall. He had never felt more alone, more isolated. But this isolation would not break him. It would only make him stronger. As the days passed, Smitty's plan began to take shape. He knew that Martin would think he was safe, that the deal would protect him. But Smitty had learned a long time ago that nothing was ever as it seemed. He would wait for the right moment, bide his time, and then strike. No one betrayed him and lived to tell the tale. But as Smitty sat there in the cold, his thoughts turned darker. Was his desire for revenge enough to blind him to everything else? Was he willing to sacrifice his soul, his humanity, to get back at Martin? The choice he faced was no longer just about survival, it was about the kind of man he would become. Would he let this betrayal define him? Would he let the anger and hatred consume him, or would he find a way to rise above it? In the end, Smitty realized that the betrayal had already done its damage. No matter how he responded, he would never be the same. But there was still a chance for him to take control, to rewrite his story on his own terms. Martin had thought he could manipulate the system, that he could walk away without facing the consequences. But Smitty would make sure that Martin's freedom was short-lived. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. And in the shadows, as the plan unfolded, Smitty knew one thing for certain: no one betrayed him and got away with it. No one. As the days turned into weeks, the walls of Smitty's prison cell began to feel more like the walls of his own mind, closing in, suffocating him with the weight of his thoughts. His anger had transformed into something darker, more dangerous. He no longer saw Martin as the man who had once been his closest friend. No, now Martin was just another enemy, one to be vanquished in a world where betrayal had become the rule, not the exception. The feeling of abandonment gnawed at him every waking moment. Betrayed by the one person he had trusted more than anyone else, Smitty was left with nothing but the ashes of what used to be. The prison's cold, gray walls were a constant reminder that his life was no longer his own. His freedom had been stripped away by a single act of treachery, and with it, his ability to see a future. But in that darkness, something had awoken within him. Something that would either destroy him or give him the power to break free. Smitty knew he couldn't remain passive. The plan was already forming in his mind, but this time, he would be careful. He would strike when the moment was right, not out of rage, but out of calculated precision. Martin had thought he could outsmart him, thought he could turn the tables and walk away untouched. But Smitty's pride, his hunger for retribution, was far greater than anything Martin could have imagined. This was no longer about survival, it was about justice, or what he believed to be justice. And it would be bloody. The prison yard was silent, save for the sound of distant murmurs and the clinking of metal gates. Smitty had spent countless hours walking the perimeter, his mind working overtime as he pieced together every detail of his plan. But it wasn't the plan itself that consumed him, it was the process of how he would become the man who could pull it off. He had to shed the remnants of the man he once was, the man who had trusted, loved, and believed in the loyalty of others. The man who had been a friend, a brother, and a partner. That man was dead. In his place was a ghost, a shadow of a man who knew only one thing, that he would never again allow anyone to control his fate. Weeks passed, and the anger inside Smitty continued to build, twisting and warping into a need for something darker. He began to question his own humanity. Was this hunger for revenge worth it? Was this consuming thirst for justice worth the price of his soul? He had crossed a line when he decided that Martin had to pay. There was no going back now. Each step forward in his plan took him further down a path where only destruction awaited. Martin, for all his cunning and manipulations, had no idea what was coming. He believed that the deal would set him free. That by betraying Smitty, he would get a second chance at life, a life that would be untouched by the mess they had created together. But Martin hadn't accounted for one thing: Smitty's ability to adapt, to evolve into a new version of himself, one that no longer feared the consequences of his actions. Smitty's eyes narrowed as he watched the guards go about their routines, the patterns of their movements imprinted in his mind. He was ready. He had studied every weak point, every vulnerability in the system. He knew how the guards would react when the alarm sounded, how the chaos would unfold. It was all part of the plan, his plan. The time had come. In the dead of night, when the prison was cloaked in darkness, Smitty made his move. He had prepared for this moment for months, his body and mind conditioned to respond without hesitation. He moved swiftly, silently, through the narrow corridors of the prison, using the shadows to conceal his every step. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained focused. The prison was his domain now. Nothing could stop him, not the guards, not the walls, not even the consequences. The final step in his plan was about to unfold. Smitty had arranged for a contact on the outside to meet him once he made his escape. The plan was intricate, dangerous, and foolproof. But that's what it took. To defeat Martin, to finally make him pay for the betrayal, Smitty would have to become someone no one recognized. He couldn't afford mistakes. He couldn't afford mercy. And then, in a moment of pure defiance, Smitty reached the final door, the one that would lead him out of the prison gates. The door that would allow him to confront Martin, to make him face the consequences of his actions. With a final glance behind him, Smitty stepped into the unknown, leaving the life he had known behind. It was a risk, but it was the only way. As he stood outside the prison, the cold air biting at his skin, Smitty felt a rush of exhilaration. He was free. But the freedom was fleeting. His eyes were set on one goal, and one goal only. To find Martin and make him understand the price of betrayal. The world outside had changed, but Smitty knew that it would be a world defined by blood and retribution. And in that world, there was no place for the weak, no place for mercy. Only survival. The days that followed were a blur of shadows, deception, and manipulation. Smitty moved carefully, keeping to the dark corners of society, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Martin had made his bed, and now he would have to lie in it, whether he wanted to or not. Smitty had made sure of that. The final confrontation would come soon, and when it did, Martin would have no choice but to face the full force of the hell he had created. But as Smitty closed in on his target, something inside him began to shift. The weight of his actions, the toll they had taken on his soul, started to press down on him. Was this who he had become? A man defined by revenge, consumed by hatred? The man who had once been loyal, who had once trusted, was no longer. And yet, there was no going back. The lines between right and wrong had blurred long ago. The man Smitty was about to become was a creature of vengeance, and there would be no redemption, no salvation. Only justice, as he saw it. And in the end, justice, true justice, would come at a price. A price that Smitty was more than willing to pay. The storm was coming, and no one, not even Martin, could stop it.